All right, so if you've ever downloaded pretty much any app, you probably get to a screen that says sign in or create an account. And usually those options are something along the lines of sign in with your email, your Google account, your Apple account, your Facebook account. And so that's basically what we're going to do in the next couple of videos. We're going to connect Google Authentication. The authentication framework is a framework inside the Firebase SDK that we can then use to sign users in and out of our app. So we're going to start this old school with literally signing in with email and password. I think that's just the safest route to learn, because when we do this, we can rewrite the code ourselves. Whereas when we get into like the sign in with Google, we're going to have to use Google's SDK, and that adds a little extra layer of complexity. So we're going to do sign in with email and password in this video, and there's actually a bunch of accessory functions related to this. So this is going to end up being a two-part video, where in this video specifically, we're going to learn what is the authentication platform, how do I use authentication, and then how can I sign in and out with email. And in the next video, we're going to cover kind of accessory functions like resetting the user's email, resetting the user's password, sending a forgot password email, and kind of things like that. So this will be a two-part video, part one being here, part two is next, but almost every other feature that we're going to cover in this series will be a one-part video. So kind of not great on my end that we had to start with a two-part feature, but this is kind of setting us up for the next 4 or 5 videos. We're going to get into more complex authentication like signing in with Apple, Google, and we're even going to look at signing in anonymously, which is a really cool feature that Firebase offers.
Welcome back, everyone. In the last video, we set up our Firebase project and we connected it to our Xcode project. So this is all the code that we had to write. Basically, we created an app delegate and then called Firebase app.configure. Of course, we've already added the Firebase Swift package into our Xcode project. If you don't know how to do that, check out the previous video. So you need that in order to do this one, of course. So let's jump back to our Firebase console here. So this is our console and we're connected already. And now we're going to start by learning authentication. So let's go to the authentication tab. And as we go through this course, I'm not going to play all of the tutorial videos that Google has, but if you go to Google's and you start going through some of their stuff. So here is authentication. They have tons of videos and well-written documentation on all of these features. I highly recommend watching at least these intro videos, which are generally like 2-3 minutes. This one is 1:40. It gives you a great overview of what each product does. So authentication is basically logging users into your application. So if you don't have authentication, like the previous apps on my channel, basically users are just opening your app and then using the app. But a lot of times you want to require the user to have some sort of user before they use your app, especially if it's any sort of like networking app where you're going to be reaching out to your backend server, because you don't want unverified users or anyone with the URL of your server to access it, right? You only want people who are authenticated to access your servers, your data, the images on your servers, things like that. So it's a good idea to basically authenticate every user in your app for every project at all times, unless it's like a user-facing app that doesn't have any sort of external component. So for example, the crypto app that I made on my channel, that was just user-facing, right? One user opens it, they make their portfolio, and that's it. There's no user-to-user action. There's no remote server. So that was fine that we didn't have authentication. But here, we're going to be reaching out to the server. So we want to make sure that all of the users in our app are authenticated. And so we're going to go ahead and get started. And these are all the different ways that we can sign users into our app. So when you see any app, you've seen the sign in with Apple, sign in with Facebook, sign in with Google. That's what these are. And if you don't want to make users sign into your app, you can just do sign in anonymously, which you can basically call behind the scenes. I'm going to do a video on that in, I think, 2 or 3 videos. But for right now, we're going to start with the basics, and we're just going to sign users into our app using an email and a password. So let's click on that one. Let's enable email password, and we're not going to do passwordless sign in. We're just going to do email password, click save. And we can now see that this is enabled. And we can go to our users tab here and we can see all of the users in our project. So I will talk more about this when we actually get a user, but let's connect this now to our code. I'm going to go to the docs like a good developer would. I'm going to go to the authentication. I'm going to go to iOS and get started. Let's see what they tell us to do. Install the SDK, choose the authentication library. So in the last video, we installed the SDK, but we only installed the analytics library. Let's now go back to our project. Let's come to the general tab. And we're going to come down here to frameworks, libraries, embedded content. We can see that we only have Firebase Analytics in our project right now. If you don't even have this and you're just joining in this video, you got to import the Firebase Swift package into your project. Then we're going to click plus and we're going to come down and add the Firebase Auth. We are not going to use Combine code for this. We're just going to use the regular Firebase Auth and click add. That's simple. It's already in our project. And now we can import Firebase Authentication in addition to just Firebase. All right. So we chose the library and then initialize the SDK. Firebase Core, I believe, is already included within the import Firebase that we did. I think if I'd go to import Firebase Core, it says it's already imported from another module, which obviously is then this one. So we're good there. Configure, we're already configured. Listen for auth state. So if the user signs in and out, you can get a callback automatically. You can attach a listener to that. We're not going to do that in our app. Instead, every time a user opens our app, we're just going to check if they are authenticated or not. And anytime they log out, we're going to handle all of that manually. So we don't really need these listeners. I think it's cleaner to not do that, but that's a architectural decision that you will have to make. All right, so sign up new users. We create a user and then we can sign in existing users with a sign in function. And then we can get user info, and that's pretty much it. So let's start building out, and there's going to be a decent amount of code and layers that we need to do in this project because, so unlike my other boot camps where each video was totally independent, these videos to some degree are going to link to each other because the code is just all connected across the different modules that we're going to add. Let's come back to our Xcode project and let's set up a screen so that users can actually sign in with email and password. So I'm going to, let's right click, create a new group. I'm going to call this Authentication, which is the section, which is our section we're working in here. New file, and let's call this one. This is going to be the first screen before they actually sign in with an email and password. So let's call this Authentication View. It's not the best naming convention, but I'd rather be explicit in these tutorials. All right, so let's set up our view here. By the time we get to this view, we're going to be in a navigation hierarchy already. So let's add the preview into a navigation stack. I have not covered navigation stack on my channel, but it's basically a navigation view. It's the new version. Some subtle differences. I've actually found the stack to be a little bit more buggy than the navigation view. So I'm still using the navigation view in most of my projects, but this eventually is what we'll get to. I will eventually do a video on it as well. Let's keep the view super simple here. I'm going to, let's give this a navigation title and we'll just say sign in. And then let's create a VStack, and we're going to have a couple buttons here for the different sign-in methods in our app. We're going to start with sign in with email, of course. So when we click it, we're going to go to another screen where we can actually sign in. So I'm going to say, let's make this a navigation link. And we don't have the next screen yet, so we'll just say hello. And then let's add, the button is going to look like just a very simple text that says sign up with email, or let's do sign in. I think that's a little bit better. Font of headline, foreground color of white, background color of, let's do color.blue. Let's give it a corner radius of about 10. And before we add the background, let's add a frame with a max width of infinity and a frame with a height of 55. I've seen a bunch of you guys ask why I always use 55 and infinity. Well, basically because that's the default look that Apple uses on their buttons. You'll see when we get to the sign in with Apple, it's just a very generic height that looks pretty solid. Let's give this some padding just so it pushes off the edges, looks a little bit better. And when we click it, it goes to the next screen. I'm going to put a spacer at the bottom just to push it up a little bit. Cool. Sign in with email. Let's create this next screen quick. Right click, new file, Swift UI view, and let's just say sign in email view. We're going to use a very simple MVVM in this course, just not even because we need it, but just because it's going to help us keep our code a little bit cleaner. Let's create a final class and let's call this sign in email view model. Conform to observable objects, and we'll initialize one. And let's initialize one in our view with an @state object, private var view model, and we'll set it equal to a new one. Awesome. On this screen, we're going to need 2 text fields, one for your email, one for your password. Let's create an @published. Var will say email. We'll start it with as a blank string, and @published var password also as a blank string. In our screen here, our screen is going to be in a navigation hierarchy already, so we'll add a navigation stack. Let's give this another vstack, a nav title of add of sign in with email, just so we know what screen we're on. All right, we're going to do a text field here with just title and text. Title is going to be email dot, it's like the placeholder, and then the text we're going to bind to the view model dot email. See it on the screen here. Let's just give this a background. Let's do color.gray.opacity, maybe 0.4. Looks a little bit better. Don't care about the UI here. Let's give this some padding just so it looks better. We'll do a corner radius of 10, and we'll give some padding to the whole VStack as well. Cool. So if I type in here, I got my email, and let's do one more for the password. And this will be a secure field, the same initializer, and we're going to bind to the password. This one will say password. And of course, the secure field is secure, so we can't see what we're actually typing. Finally, we're going to add a button that'll have an action and a label. Let's take the design from our button from the last view, copy that, just paste it on in here, and we'll just say sign in. All right, let's again give this a spacer to push it to the top. Here we go. A lot of setup so far. Let's connect this to our app. So our authentication view navigation link should go to the sign in email view. Boom, that's looking good, guys. And now let's actually configure this. So sign in with email view. I'm going to come up here. We have our view model, and we're going to actually need another file. So what I want to do is take all of the code that's specific for the authentication SDK and put it in its own file. This way it is separate from our views and our view models, and we can reuse it across our app. We can reuse it even in other apps. So I'm going to create a separate class, and I'm going to do that in a separate file. So we're going to do a new file, and this one's not going to be a view. So we're just going to do a Swift file, and let's Authentication Manager, and click create. And this again will also be a final class. So I actually forgot to mention, I know some of you are going to probably ask in the comments, I'm using final class because final implies that we're not going to inherit from this class in another class. Class inheritance is not something that I've covered on my channel, frankly, because I don't use it very often in apps. So almost every class that we make, we're going to mark as final. There's slight performance benefit by having that word final there. And also all of our view models, we want to put onto the main actor. If you are not familiar with what the main actor is, or you don't know Swift concurrency, I highly recommend watching my Swift concurrency playlist before this. It is a little harder than this playlist, but almost all the functions we're going to write in this playlist are using Swift concurrency. And so getting a good background on that would definitely help you here. So I'm not going to explain what all of actors and everything do in this course. Let's go to our Authentication Manager. Let's create it. And we're going to use singletons in this course. Again, I'm not a fan of singletons. If you know what they are, we're going to create a single global instance of the Authentication Manager by doing static, let's say let shared. This is going to be a shared instance, and we're going to set it equal to a authentication manager. This is going to be the only instance of this class in our whole app, so we can make the initializer private. So we'll add a private init, and we're not going to do anything in the initializer, so we'll just leave it blank for now. This singleton design pattern is not something that I recommend in larger applications. There's a lot of limitations of this when you try to start adding testing, you try to use dependency, but up to this point on my channel, I have not covered that in detail. So if you're interested in how to not use singletons, I do have a video in the advanced series called Dependency Injection. And we talk about the limitations of singletons, why it's a bad design pattern, and basically a better way to get around it by using dependency injection. There's a lot more code that is required in your app to use dependency injection successfully. And I don't want to deal with all of that in this bootcamp. So we're going to do the singleton design pattern. It's going to work, but just know in a larger production app, this is probably not the best method to do. All right. And so we go back to the Firebase docs, which I have here. The first thing it told us to do was sign up new users, which we're going to try to do. Auth create user with email and password. And so that's what we're going to do here. So let's create a function called createUser. And let's import Firebase authentication, Firebase auth. And let's call that function. Let's call auth.auth.createUser. There are two options here. So the completion handler, if you're not using Swift concurrency, and then the async version, which is what we're going to use. Again, you need to understand async await for the rest of this course. Pretty easy to pick up if you haven't already. So in order to use an async function, we need to be in an asynchronous context, and the function also throws. So let's make this function throw as well. And let's call createUser with email and password. Let's pass in email to this function and password. Bottom is super simple. And this is going to return us some value. So we'll say let AuthDataResult equals this. All right, this function can throw errors, so we need to try to do it. And it's asynchronous, so we need to await the result. All right, this returns us a AuthDataResult, which if we click on this or we Command-Shift-O and go to AuthDataResult, we can see that it's a object that includes a Firebase user. This is basically the user's information after being authenticated into our platform. I don't want to send an AuthDataResult back to our app because I don't really know what it is. I don't know if every authentication is going to give us the exact same data. So we're going to create our own data model off of this. So if I look at the AuthDataResult, we can see that we're going to get the user, additional info, their credential. Within the user, we're going to get, let's see, UID is their user ID. We're going to get their email if they signed in with an email, a photo URL if they have one connected to their email account, and then whether or not they're an anonymous user, which we're not going to do right now, but later we're going to incorporate anonymous authentication. So for right now, I just want to get the first three things, and let's create a local data model to hold those. So we'll create a struct AuthDataResultModel, we'll call it. And we're going to put on the UID, which is of type string. We're going to put in the email, which is going to be optional because if you sign in a different way without the email, we might not get one. And we're going to set the photo URL, which is also going to be an optional string. So here we're going to say let result equals an AuthDataResultModel. The UID will be AuthDataResult.UID or .user.UID. The email will be AuthDataResults.user.email and AuthDataResults.user. Photo URL. There's other data here, phone number. We're not going to get that because we're not doing sign in with phone number. So we'll just keep it to this for now. This is fine. This is good code, but we can make it even cleaner. So I want to initialize a AuthDataResultModel from a AuthDataResult rather than having to do this every time. In here, I'm just going to create a quick convenient initializer. And we'll initialize it from a user. So we can see that we have the user here. So this is a user of type user. And we're just going to pass that in. We're going to say user of type user. It knows what user is because that's coming from the Firebase SDK. And then so we're going to set self.uid equal to user.uid, self.email equal user.email, self.photo URL equals user.photo URL. Simple. Now we can just set our auth data result model from the AuthDataResult.user. And then we can actually just return this back to our application. So we're going to throw and return AuthDataResultModel. So here, let's just return this instead. That is it. That is all the code that we need to create this user in our authentication platform. What is wrong here? This is of type. So let's convert the URL to a string, absolute string. I want to keep these as simple data types because when we add them to our database, I only want to upload types that are supported in the database. I don't know if URL is, but I know string is, and that's just an easier way to deal with it. Awesome. Let's call this from our app. Let's jump back to our sign in email view. Let's create a function in the view model called sign in. And we're going to have email and password. Firstly, let's make sure that there is a valid email and password. We're going to say guard email.isEmpty. And we're going to say password.isEmpty. And we want to make sure that they are not empty. So we're going to use the exclamation point behind them to indicate not password empty. Else, let's just print out here, no email or password found. And let's return. If this is your real application, you're going to want to do some validation here, not just print out. Please enter a valid email address and do some validation on that. If you want to make your passwords super difficult, maybe require capital letters or something, you could do validation here. We're just going to keep it simple. And then we're going to call our function. So we're going to say Authentication Manager, shared instance, createUser. It's grayed out because we're not in an asynchronous context. So let's go in async throws. And let's create this user with email and password. All right. We're going to say let returned user data equals, and we have to try await this value. Just going to close this for a second. All right. And then if we get this data, we're going to want to do something and actually sign them into our app. Actually, let's not make this function async throws. Let's create a task inside the function. Just keep it a little simpler for our sake. Create a do catch here. And if we get the value, let's print success. And let's print the returned user data. If we get the error, let's print error and print out that error that we're getting in that catch statement. Again, if you don't know what tasks are, if you don't know what a do catch is, if you don't know what try await is, all of this is covered in the Swift concurrency playlist on my channel. Highly recommend. Let's call this function and see what we get. So we're going to come down here. We're going to call viewModel.sign in when they click the button. Let's go to our authentication view. Let's make that the first view in our app here. And let's just add in a navigation stack to the hierarchy and then authentication view. I'm going to build and run this, and let's actually start authenticating our first user. All right, sign in with email. Now we have our sign in with email screen. Let's just create a fake email. We're going to say hello@testing.com. And I'm going to create a fake password and sign in. And down here we get in our console success, so we know it worked, and the auth data result. We can see a UID, we can see the email that I signed in on, and there's no photo URL, of course. Let's check this out in our console. So we're going to come to our authentication console, reload it, and boom. Here's our first user in our console. We can see how they signed in with this sign means email. If they signed in with Apple, you would see the Apple sign here, and we can see their user ID. This is super handy. This is probably the most important part of authentication. We get a unique user ID for every user. And this is also going to help us deduplicate users. So if hello@testing.com tries to create a second account, it's going to fail because it already has an authentication and a user ID for that user. We can copy the UID if we need to. We have the ability to reset the user's password. So if you get an email from the user, they forgot their password, we can disable their accounts, maybe if they're blocked, or delete their account, which we can also do from the code. And we're going to get into that in the next video. All right. So if they're signed in, we should probably update the UI here. Let's create a little bit of a flow for our application. So instead of going to the app view, instead of going to the authentication view, let's create a new file here and just call this root view. That'd be the first view in our application. Cool. I'm going to take this navigation stack. I'm going to put in the root view here. I'm going to put in the root view here. Move this up a little. This is going to be a navigation stack, and we're going to, let's see here. How do we keep this simple, guys? Keep it simple, stupid is almost always the best bet for tutorials and for building your app. All right, now we have this view. So after they sign in, we want to dismiss this view and show like maybe the entrance to our app, the actual signed in state. So we're going to create a profile view in 1 second, or a settings view rather. So for right now, let's just create a Z stack. Let's create a navigation stack again for this hierarchy, and we'll put a text here that says just settings for now. And what we're going to do is create a .full screen cover, and we'll have an isPresented Boolean. So we'll say at state private, and we'll say show sign in view of type bool, set it equal to false to start, because most of our users are going to be signed in already when they use our app the second time they open it, and forever in the future, they'll be signed in. So false is probably a good starting state. Let's bind to it. Let's open the content here, and we're going to add in our navigation stack for the authentication view here. All right, every app launch on Appear, as soon as the app loads, let's create a function that tries to fetch the authenticated user from Firebase. So we have our function to create the user, but let's create another function to actually get a user that's already authenticated into the app. Let's create a func, and we'll say getAuthenticatedUser. This function also throws and returns us an AuthDataResultModel. We're going to do the same thing that we did down here. So firstly, let's try to get the user. We'll say let user equals auth.auth.currentUser. So again, this is the same user value that we have up here that we are initializing our result model for. So firstly, let's try to get this user, because you see this is optional. So if the user is not authenticated in our app, this will be nil. If they are authenticated, we're going to get their value. So we'll do a garb let here, say else. If we can't get the user, we want to throw an error back to our application. I'm not going to create custom errors in this series, so we'll just use a URL error for now and be lazy developers. And let's just say maybe bad server response for now. If we do get this user, let's return it back to the application. So we will return a AuthDataResultModel from the user. Great. Let's go back to our app. On Appear, we should actually also note that this function does not have the async keyword in here. And that's pretty important. The async keyword implies that it's asynchronous, which implies that it's going to reach out to the server to Firebase. This getAuthenticateDUser is not asynchronous, meaning it's going to check for the authenticated user locally. It's not reaching out to the server. And that's incredibly important, because if our app is loading for the first time and we're checking if a user is authenticated, we want to check that basically synchronously before the whole app loads, right? Because what if this was asynchronous and we had to wait, then we might have to add like a loading screen into our app, or we might get the wrong value before the server returns. So what's happening here is once we authenticate a user, it's being saved in the SDK locally, and then we can just get the value from the local SDK, which is amazing. So let's come back to our app. On Appear, we're going to say let authenticated user equals Authentication Manager shared getAuthenticateDUser. And then we're going to set the value for show sign in view based on whether or not the user is valid, right? If the user is nil, then we know they're not signed in. So we're going to set self.show sign in view equals the value of if authenticated user is equal to nil, then show sign in view is equal to true, otherwise false. This call can throw, so we need to try. I'm going to use an optional try here because I don't really care what the error is thrown back. If it's an error, it's nil. And we're going to clean this up because if authenticated user is equal to nil, so if this is true, then we're going to return true. If this is false, then we're going to return false. So since these values are the same as these values, we can just say show sign in view is equal to authenticated user is equal to nil. We don't actually need the ternary operator. And you'll see in the preview here, in the preview, I have not signed in yet because I did it on the simulator. And so this is now gone. And if I run my app real quick to the simulator, which we already signed in on, it should show me the settings screen, which is perfect. In our settings view, let's set that up real quick and let's add a log out button. So I'm going to create another view here. Let's right click new file and SwiftUI view. Let's just call it a settings view. All right. We're going to be inside a navigation stack already. Let's just use a list here. The nav title. Let's just call it settings. And we're going to create a button. Let's use the native buttons here with the title. And let's just say log out. And we need an action, of course. Let's create our main actor. Final class, call this settings view model of type observable object, open the brackets, observable object. I'm getting terrible completions recently. And we're going to create a func in here called log out. And this function is going to call a function in our authentication manager. So let's come in here. Let's create another func. Let's actually call it signOut. Sorry, it shouldn't be log out. And we're going to call auth.auth.signOut. Super simple. And this again is synchronous. So it's not async, meaning it's going to sign out locally. We don't need to ping the server. It happens immediately, which is awesome. It throws an error, so we can try and mark this as throws as well. So if this does not throw an error, that means they're successfully signed out. Let's go back to our app. We're going to call Authentication Manager shared.signout. And I'm going to throw this error back to the view down here. All right. This call can throw, so we will try here. And then in my view, I'm just going to create a task with a do catch statement. And I'm just going to say try view model, which we have not initialized yet. We'll create an @state object var private var view model, set it equal to a settings view model, and let's call view model dot logout. I should make this sign out some better. Cool. I'm doing a little bit of architecture here, not too much. All right. And so when we log out, we then want to show that authentication screen again. So back in our app where we have settings, we're going to actually add a settings view. And then we want to bind to this value so that we can then, from the settings view, change the value of show sign in view. So in the settings view, very simply, let's add a binding var, and we'll say show sign in view of type bool. And if we sign out successfully, let's just say show sign in view equals show sign in view is then true. And I'm just going to print out an error if we get one. If this is your real app, you should obviously handle your errors or display that to the user. We're not going to get one. Let's fix our preview with just a constant of true or false, I guess. And let's set this up in our app here. So here and show sign in view. Awesome. Let's run the app real quick. I know this was a lot of setup, guys. We have a lot of videos ahead that are basically going to build off of this same little sample project here. And so I wanted to set this up in a nice, clean way so that the code's not very confusing in the next bunch of videos. All right, we are signed in and then we can log out. Let's go to sign in again. I'm going to use the same email and password, hello@testing.com, and my password. And you're going to notice that it did not work because this email address is already used by another account, which means I can't create another for the same email address. Instead, I have to sign in to that email address. And there's a bunch of kind of caveats and edge cases like that when you're dealing with sign in with email. So in this video, we just did create an account and then log out. And in the next video, we're going to follow up and do the rest of the sign in with email functions, such as signing back into an existing account, deleting it, requesting to change your email, change your password, all of these edge cases that are probably required for your app if you're doing sign in with email. All right, this was a long one, a lot of setup, but now we are ready to groove in the next couple videos. Thanks for watching. See you guys in the next one.